Vamos a empezar con la prueba de interpretación. Vamos a empezar por la cabina de inglés. Probando cabina de inglés. Buenas tardes. ¿A quién tenemos? No tenemos.
Sí, probando. Yes, this is Charlie Roberts. Testing, English channel, and Kelly should be there as well. Qué bueno. Ok, gracias. Apago.
Vamos con la segunda cabina de inglés.
Hi, this is Kelly. Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Wonderful. Thank you.
La cabina de español. Probando la cabina de español. ¿Se fue? ¿Se demoró? Ok. Un refresh, a ver si. Un refresh. Gracias. Segunda cabina de español. Iniciar. Un pelín lento. Ok, bueno. Dale, gracias, se escucha muy bien. Ahora nos vamos a la cabina de portugués. ¿A quién tenemos en portugués? Mónica, perfecto. Espera porque me escucho yo mismo. Pero dame un segundo. A ver, ahora Mónica, seguimos probando. 1. No, me sigo escuchando yo. Haz tú un refresh entonces, a ver. Sí. Haz un refresh a ver si seguimos con la segunda cabina de portugués y volvemos con Mónica. Alexandra. Perfecto. A ti te escucho muy bien. Sí, excelente. Gracias. A ver, Mónica, que ya volvió. Vamos a probar, Mónica. No, sigue igual. Sí. Puede que sea. Ok, perfecto. Voy a francés. Vamos a francés entonces. A ver, francés, Catherine. Perfecto, Catherine, se escucha muy bien. Buenas tardes, sí. Gracias, Catherine. Segunda cabina de francés. Elizabeth. Perfecto. Muy bien, Elizabeth. Listo. Mónica, estoy pendiente de ti a ver cuando cambies el micrófono. Vamos a ver a la señora Rueda. Ahora sí pueden sentar cámara y micrófono.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Muy buenas tardes.
Ahí, perfecto.
¿Me escuchan bien ahí?
Se escucha bien, sí.
Ok, entonces, a ver, para aclarar el punto es, ustedes cuando me ceden la palabra, recién allí yo puedo prender la cámara y prender el micrófono, ¿verdad?
Correcto.
O sea, antes de eso va a salir como sin posibilidad de verlo y sin posibilidad de verme y de poder hablar. Eso es así, ¿verdad?
Así es.
Entonces, procedimentalmente, cuando sea el momento de mi intervención.
Management projects in the Plata Basin and worked with governments and partners in the design of an investment portfolio valued at $90 million. Additionally, the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas continued to share relevant best practices and responses to the pandemic on energy and air quality. These few examples indicate our collective impact. We cannot do this alone. It is now more urgent than ever to address the region's structural weaknesses, to recover from the health, economic, and social crises occasioned by the pandemic, and prepare for future shocks. It is imperative that we work together as we risk losing recent development gains and seeing millions fall back into poverty. It is time for the region to redirect course and pursue a more sustainable, resilient, and equitable future for all. We are in this together.
But the resilience building agenda is too big for any one stakeholder to address acting alone, and simply bringing together stakeholders, whether at the national, subnational, regional, or global level, is not enough. Effective, focused, and sustained coordination among stakeholders is paramount to provide countries with integrated and comprehensive support.
The OAS, as a hemispheric forum and honest broker, must continue to facilitate this process while we work with member states towards the attainment of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Cooperation, collaboration, and partnerships that include all actors strengthen us, enabling us to be more than the sum of our parts. We can and we must work together. The future of our region depends on it.
CIM tiene una agenda enorme en el tema de democracia y de liderazgos. El primer ámbito tiene que ver con la gobernanza electoral, para que esta gobernanza electoral responda a las necesidades con las que fue creada, y es buscar los espacios de redistribución del poder. Después hay un programa interamericano sobre liderazgo de las mujeres, donde generamos conocimiento y también tenemos cursos de capacitación. Hay un poderoso curso que ha llegado a más de 1000 mujeres con más de 15 ediciones, que es para candidatas electorales, en las cuales conversamos con ellas, pero también nos ponemos en una agenda de solidaridad y articulación y alianzas entre las mujeres, a pesar de las múltiples diferencias ideológicas o de partidos políticos. También hablamos de los temas de violencia política, porque no es lo mismo llegar que quedarse, y la violencia política es una forma de ejercicio de disciplinar a las mujeres para que vuelvan al mundo de lo privado y enfrentar la violencia, hacer buenas investigaciones, buenas leyes que permitan sancionar la violencia política. Es parte de las aspiraciones de la CIM en este programa de liderazgo de las mujeres. La aspiración histórica de las mujeres es estar en el mundo de lo público, que nuestro trabajo sea remunerado y que tenga un reconocimiento. COVID ha puesto en evidencia una profundización de las brechas existentes para el logro de este objetivo. Estas brechas existentes ahora dan cuenta de que podríamos tener un rezago de más de 2 décadas en el mundo laboral, que el cierre de brechas que se previó que podía tardar 100 años en cerrarse, ahora se habla de 135 años para cerrar la brecha entre los hombres y las mujeres. Entonces nuestro objetivo es que miren el derecho de las mujeres al empoderamiento económico, que el statement "quédate en casa", que es un viejo conocido del patriarcado, no sea que nos quedemos en casa siempre, y que entendamos que la inserción de la mitad de la población, de este talento humano que tiene una serie de ventajas competitivas, es necesario para el crecimiento económico. De manera que la CIM está colocando esta realidad, está colocando las necesidades de las mujeres y está haciendo unas recomendaciones de rutas para poder cumplir con el derecho al empoderamiento económico y con el crecimiento económico que requieren nuestras empobrecidas economías en tiempos de COVID.
Esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos no podemos ser neutrales.
than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
The COVID-19 pandemic brought unprecedented challenges to our member states and the people we serve. In response, the OAS Secretariat for Integral Development adopted a three-pronged approach by 1. Adjusting our portfolio of existing projects, 2. Exploring new projects to meet emerging needs, and 3. Expanding multi-sectoral partnerships. The results achieved in 2020 demonstrate the resilience of our member states and the commitment of the OAS SETI to work with member states and partners towards our common goals in the development of our region. Our Network on Competitiveness launched the COVID-19 Ideas Accelerator, sharing 250 tools, health solutions, responses, and recovery plans. The Network for Labor Administration published a portfolio of responses from ministries of labor to COVID-19, sharing over 420 measures taken to protect workers, employment, and income. Likewise, the Inter-American Teacher Education Network series, Teaching STEM in Quarantine, provided 117,000 teachers with key tools to continue advancing STEM education during the pandemic. Through its network and platforms, the Inter-American Committee on Ports promoted international and national best practices, guidelines, protocols, and recommendations on COVID-19 safety measures and continuity of logistic operations. Initiatives such as the Education in Times of Change platform allowed us to meet urgent needs by offering timely tools on virtual education and a dedicated space for ministries to share strategies, actions, and solutions. Other programs such as the Row Fund stepped up, providing emergency grants to offset the challenges imposed on our students by the pandemic. SETI's partnerships are adding value to member states in the form of technical assistance, training, and access to tools and services. In partnership with leading private sector institutions, we offered micro, small, and medium enterprises access to online tools and training, increasing their visibility and participation in e-commerce, a key to their survival and growth in the pandemic and post-pandemic era. A new OAS SETI Facebook initiative provided 85,000 MSMEs across the region with capacity building opportunities and WhatsApp business tools to aid response, recovery, and resilience building. The Caribbean Small Business Development Center's program achieved real impact, supporting new businesses, expanding sales, and driving growth. A new network of Caribbean SBDCs will broaden the program's reach. The Inter-American Committee on Tourism, the C2, convened ministerial-level policy dialogue in an urgent response to the impact of the pandemic on the hard-hit tourism and hospitality sectors. Policymakers and experts discussed biosanitary protocols, travel and visa facilitation, among other critical areas for the sector's recovery. Partnering with the George Washington University and the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, we went ahead with the scheduled first Indigenous Tourism Forum of the Americas, pivoting to a virtual format and convening over 240 participants from indigenous communities, the private sector, and governments. SETI also integrated sustainable development practices in the COVID-19 response. The pandemic is a daily reminder of the links between water, health, sanitation, food security, and nutrition. We ensured the continuity of our water management projects in the Plata Basin and worked with governments and partners in the design of an investment portfolio valued at $90 million. Additionally, the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas continued to share relevant best practices and responses to the pandemic on energy and air quality. These few examples indicate our collective impact. We cannot do this alone. It is now more urgent than ever to address the region's structural weaknesses, to recover from the health, economic, and social crises occasioned by the pandemic and prepare for future shocks. It is imperative that we work together as we risk losing recent development gains and seeing millions fall back into poverty. It is time for the region to redirect course and pursue a more sustainable, resilient, and equitable future for all. We are in this together.
But the resilience building agenda is too big for any one stakeholder to address acting alone, and simply bringing together stakeholders, whether at the national, subnational, regional, or global level, is not enough. Effective, focused, and sustained coordination among stakeholders is paramount to provide countries with integrated and comprehensive support.
The OAS, as a hemispheric forum and honest broker, must continue to facilitate this process while we work with member states towards the attainment of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Cooperation, collaboration, and partnerships that include all actors strengthen us, enabling us to be more than the sum of our parts. We can and we must work together. The future of our region depends on it.
Suriname, and Uruguay. We have quorum, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Good afternoon, esteemed colleagues. Following verification of the quorum by the Secretariat, I'm pleased to declare open this special meeting pursuant to Article 14 of the Statutes of the Permanent Council and Article 37 of the Rules of Procedure. The meeting has been convened in response to the request made by the Permanent Mission of Mexico in its capacity as the coordinator of the OAS LGBTI core group, and on behalf of its member delegations to consider the topic best practices for the inclusion of LGBTI persons in the Americas. In accordance with Article 43 of the Rules of Procedure, we will proceed to adopt the order of business for this meeting, which was in document CP/OD 2403/22. And actually we have on the agenda one main issue, and that is the best practice for inclusion of LGBTI persons in the Americas, first with a number of presentations, and then a panel of experts, afterwards remarks by delegations of the member states. So that's the order of business for today. If there are no observations, we will proceed to adopt this order of business without amendment. Adopted. Esteemed colleagues, we shall now proceed to the second item on the order of business, which is to consider the best practices for the inclusion of LGBTI persons in the Americas. Today we will hear presentations from prominent experts on national and regional best practices in LGBTI inclusion, combating discrimination against them, and promoting a culture of rights to combat cultural and social prejudices in our region. On behalf of the Permanent Council, I express my warmest welcome to the speakers who have joined us today in this meeting, and I thank them in advance for their work and commitment to advancing the causes of LGBTI persons in the Americas. I also extend sincerest thanks to the Permanent Mission of Mexico and the OAS LGBTI core group for their support towards organizing this meeting. Before we proceed, I would like to kindly request that our panelists adhere to the time allotted for their presentations. Your cooperation is greatly appreciated. I'm pleased to offer now the floor to Ambassador Luz Elena Baños, the Permanent Representative of Mexico as coordinator of the OAS LGBTI core group. Ambassador, welcome, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On behalf of the LGBTI core group of the OAS, as coordinator of the group, the delegation of Mexico extends greetings to all, each and every person here, and thanks the holding of this, expresses gratitude for the holding of this special session, which is on the eve of the Day of Tolerance, which has been celebrated every November 16th at the edition of the United Nations since 1995. The American Convention on Human Rights recognizes that the essential rights of all persons are not born from the fact of being a national of a given state, but rather they have as their foundation the attributes of the human person. And at Article 2, it sets forth the duty of states to adopt, in keeping with their constitutions and provisions of the convention, legislative or other measures as necessary to make said rights and liberties effective. Unfortunately, today, there are still millions of people in our hemisphere who continue to have their rights violated and discriminated against due to fundamental attributes of the human person, such as their identity and bodily characteristics. There's still a great lack of knowledge about human diversity and its biopsychosocial manifestation. Sexual and corporal diversity has not only been common among pre-Columbian peoples and civilizations, but the Amerindian societies were highly complex and sophisticated in their understanding and appreciation, their often ritual appreciation of this reality. The Barbash, or two spirits in North America, the Natli in the Navajo people, the Mushi and the in Oaxaca, are just some recognitions, ancestral recognitions of the sexual and corporal diversity in our region. The acknowledgement of sexual, bodily or corporal and gender diversity has been moving forward in several countries of the region, because upon recognizing diversity, one reduces discrimination and exclusion of persons who are different. One clear example of the correct way forward that the states have set out on to fight discrimination was the adoption in 2013 in Guatemala of the Inter-American Convention Against All Forms of Discrimination and Intolerance. It states at Article 1 a broad and ambitious definition of discrimination. It came into force in 2020 as of the deposit of the instrument of ratification by Mexico. Fighting discrimination on grounds of sexuality, sexual expression, orientation, gender identity has now been codified, and it is now inter-American law in force. In 2016, a group of member states of the OAS, we founded the LGBTI core group here at the OAS, with the aim of supporting regional efforts geared to ensuring that all persons may live free from violence and discrimination on grounds of their sexual orientation or identity and gender expression, and also to combat the many and overlapping forms of discrimination that LGBTI persons face. During under the lemma, Together in Fighting for Equality and Against Discrimination, the OAS adopted the Omnibus Resolution Promotion and Protection of Human Rights, in whose section Human Rights and Prevention of Discrimination and Violence Against LGBTI Persons resolved to urge the member states to continue strengthening their legislation, institutions, and public policies to eliminate barriers faced by LGBTI persons in the enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and to adopt measures aimed at preventing, investigating, holding accountable, and punishing and eradicating violence and discrimination against persons based on their sexual orientation and their gender identity and or expression and their sexual characteristics, and ensure that the victims of violence and discrimination have access to justice in conditions of equality. The state has a preponderant role to play in promoting a culture of rights that fights prejudice and discrimination against LGBTI persons. Multi-sectoral efforts are strategic for the development and progressivity of human rights. Thus, in today's session, we have pulled together expert voices from different sectors to reflect on persons in their full diversity, highlighting the intersectionality of situations situations that may affect their lives of persons and of the LGBTI community. And so we work to strengthen the protection, promotion, guarantee, and respect for their human rights. By constitutional mandate in Mexico, all forms of discrimination motivated by sexual orientation is prohibited or for any other reason that might represent an attack on human dignity. Because of this, the Federal Act to Prevent and Eliminate Discrimination prohibits homophobia and any other form of exclusion, restriction, or preference, which by act or omission, intentionally or not, has as its purpose or result obstructing the enjoyment or exercise of human rights and freedoms based on sexual orientation or any other motive. The Supreme Court of Justice of Mexico has handed down several judgments that confirm the universality of human rights. Since 2010, it was determined that restricting marriage to a union between a man and a woman is unconstitutional because it promotes inequality. In 2017, the right of same-sex couples were recognized to have a family life, including raising children, thereby recognizing the right to same-sex couple adoption. In 2018, it was determined that the state must guarantee persons that they can exercise their rights without being forced to put forward an identity that does not represent who they individually are as recognized, such as recognizing gender identity. In 2019, it was established that LGBTI couples have the right to Social Security. And recently, in June of 2022, the first chamber of the Supreme Court of Justice of Mexico ruled on Amparo under Review 155/2021, in whose operative part it acknowledged that children and adolescents are the holders of the right to identity in the same terms as adults, allowing minors to have access to the administrative procedure for recognizing their gender as they perceive it. This in Mexico City since October, with the approval of this same law in Tamaulipas, same-sex marriage is now legal throughout Mexico. In 19 different states of the country, provisions have been adopted to recognize self-perceived gender identity to go into the civil registry by administrative procedure, avoiding lengthy and costly judicial procedures. These steps forward extend to all of the Mexican diaspora thanks to an ambitious program for modernization and consular modernization undertaken since 2019 by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. At this time, consular services include same-sex marriage, the issuance of birth certificates that recognize gender identity, as well as the consular registration, third-generation consular registration, which constitutes the first official Mexican identity document that is non-binary. As part of our policy of consular protection, which is a pioneer policy internationally since February of 2019, the strategy is being implemented to provide services for migrants, by which all of our consulates in the United States have established task forces, strategic partnerships, and memoranda of understanding with strategic partners and specialized actors to benefit Mexican persons who belong to the LGBTI community, thereby providing comprehensive consular and specialized consular attention to the particular challenges that this community faces. In addition to activism in various international fora, in which Mexico participates in the various LGBTI core groups, Mexico also participates actively in multi-sectoral initiatives such as the Coalition for Equality of Rights, of which it is been an active member since 2016. In September 2022, during the global conference held in Buenos Aires, Mexico, together with Germany, was assumed the co-chair of this coalition, reiterating its commitment to build a world in which human rights and fundamental freedoms of all persons are respected, no matter their sexual orientation, their gender identity, or their gender expression, or their sexual characteristics. I'd like to note here the important work of compilation and generating statistical data that's been undertaken by several institutions in Mexico, such as the National Institute of Statistics, Geography, and Informatics, the National Council to Prevent Discrimination, and the National Commission on Human Rights. Exercises such as the National Survey on Discrimination, the Survey on Discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity, and the Intersex Survey for persons who have congenital bodily variations in their sexual characteristics. All of these have helped give visibility to the needs of the LGBTI population, and they made it possible to articulate adequate public policies to address the issues they face. Of special relevance is the National Survey on Sexual Diversity and Gender Diversity, which was drawn up by the Geography Institute and Statistics Institute. This is the first in our country, one of the few in the world, that is dedicated to identifying population based on sexual orientation and gender identity probabilistically. We'll hear more about this exercise in the panel of experts. There will be a complete explanation of it. Mr. Chairman, my delegation is proud to introduce this or present this special session as one of the various activities of the Mexican coordination of the LGBTI core group of the OAS. We appreciate the response to this call, and we recognize the expert voices that are of such high level and so committed who are participating in this permanent council to give visibility to the progress of policies and practices of inclusion that we have attained in our region. Our core group expresses its wishes for this special session to be a valuable contribution to recognize the efforts of the various players, the various stakeholders, and above all else, to encourage the work promoting a more just and egalitarian region to strengthen all rights for all persons. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your remarks, and I now ask the Secretariat to show the intervention of Commissioner Roberta Clark, Rapporteur of the Rights of LGBTI Persons of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. This is supposed to be a video, so let's see if we can get it going.
Good day. Chair of the Permanent Council of the Organization of American States, Ambassador Martin Shalwick, Permanent Representative of Suriname, General Secretariat, distinguished permanent representatives, distinguished delegations of permanent observers, representatives of civil society. I would like to thank the Permanent Council of the Organization of American States for this opportunity to address you at this special meeting. I appreciate the Permanent Mission of Mexico and the member states that make up the OAS LGBTI core group for their commitment for the inclusion, visibility, and rights of LGBTI persons in the work of the Inter-American system. The Inter-American Commission is conscious of the challenges that remain in our region towards the respect, guarantee, and fulfillment of the rights of gay, lesbian, bisexual, intersex, trans, non-binary, two-spirit, and gender-diverse people in the Americas and the Caribbean. On a daily basis, we monitor different forms of violence and discrimination that LGBTI persons face. The existence of criminalization laws still present in the criminal codes of several member states and hampers access to human rights, particularly for gay men. And these laws have a negative cultural effect on societal attitudes. Even where there has been decriminalization, LGBTI human rights defenders speak of the persistence of prejudice and bias, which find expression in the use of other laws to persecute and harass LGBTI persons. We need to do so much more to root out discrimination, not only in laws and policies, but in culture. Notwithstanding the jurisprudence and the legal and the advisory opinion of the Inter-American Court, Across the region, there is uneven recognition of the right to gender identity for trans persons. Similarly, even though marriage equality is becoming a reality in an increasing number of member states, the rights of same-sex couples and their families are still undermined. We cannot deny that historically marginalized populations feel the negative impacts of crises disproportionately, whether these are disasters or public health pandemics such as in COVID. Such populations like LGBTI persons tend to experience higher levels of precarious employment and unemployment and are not covered by social protection. They are often ignored by policy measures that fail to take a differentiated approach. The Inter-American Commission considers that the recognition of the rights of LGBTI persons is a fundamental factor in achieving non-discrimination, equality, and dignity, as well as in combating violence in order to achieve a more just society founded on rule of law. So when we look at progress, what do we look for? What do we mean by progress? First, it is important to talk about the eradication and prevention of discrimination and violence. So for example, last year, Canada banned the so-called conversion practices across their country. These harmful practices lack any scientific foundation, and they aim at changing people's sexual orientation and gender identity and disproportionately affect vulnerable LGBTI youth and children. The courts in St. Kitts and Nevis and in Antigua and Barbuda have declared the criminalization of same-sex consensual sexual activity to be a violation of human rights and unconstitutional. The decisions reflect a growing understanding of the diversity of the human experience and an appreciation of the non-negotiability of equality and non-discrimination, and we expect will contribute to a more equitable inclusion of LGBTI persons. So non-discrimination is not just a right in and of itself, and very importantly so, but it is also a precondition for the enjoyment of other rights. This was recognized, for example, in 2020 by the Supreme Court of the United States, which decided that discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity is prohibited under the federal employment non-discrimination law. Another example comes from Mexico, where all 32 states recognize same-sex unions. Not only do these laws and policies have a positive cultural effect towards the acceptance of diverse families, but they also better support a host of other rights, such as freedom of movement and equal opportunity in employment and access to services. The Commission also takes note of measures taken towards the recognition of the rights of trans and non-binary and gender diverse persons, who are often the most visible and vulnerable face of the LGBTI community. The recognition of so far, legal gender identity recognition, according to human rights standards of the inter-American system that are based in self-determination and simplified procedures, is possible in Argentina, in Brazil, in Colombia, in Chile, and Uruguay. Other states have taken positive measures towards gender recognition, but there are still some limitations, for example, in Bolivia and Ecuador. Regarding the rights of non-binary persons, last year in 2021 in Argentina, the right to non-binary identity in legal documents, both passports and national IDs, was advanced. And the Colombian Constitutional Court issued a ruling demanding non-binary options to be available in ID documents. Similarly, the United States government has implemented steps towards recognizing non-binary passports for American citizens. This is a positive trend and consistent with the Inter-American Court's Advisory Opinion 24 of 2017, which we encourage all states to follow. Scientific, statistical, and disaggregated data is essential to guide the design and implementation of law and policy that aim to guarantee the rights of LGBTI persons. And so the Commission has taken notice of progress and good practices regarding data collection. This year, the People Defender's Office in Bolivia announced a virtual survey aimed at supporting the legal and policy needs of LGBTI persons. Similar initiatives were undertaken in Mexico, including in 2019, to understand the living conditions of intersex persons. This was a pioneer project at the global level. In May of this year, the state of Honduras recognized the state's international responsibility in matters involving the death of Vicky Hernandez, a trans woman who was murdered in the context of societal prejudice and social unrest. This recognition of international responsibility reflects the state's commitment to take measures to counteract societal negative attitudes and prejudices that exacerbate violence against LGBTI persons and especially trans people. There are many other positive examples, which because of time I cannot highlight. The point is that the Commission considers it important for member states to share and learn from the approaches across the region. In closing, let me say that under international human rights customary law and under the jurisprudence of the American human rights system, discrimination in all its forms against LGBTI persons is a violation of human rights. There are no ifs, ands, or buts about this. We must never have recourse to the narrative of culture or so-called traditional values to justify discrimination. In our Americas and the Caribbean, we live the legacy of horrific violence, historical violence, extreme exploitation, and pernicious employment of discrimination to justify that violence and exploitation. And so we have the sacred obligation to root out inequalities and to end intersectional exclusion. We have the responsibility to shape social, economic, and political and cultural relations that better assure everyone of a decent quality of a life of dignity, and a life of freedoms. And states have very specific accountabilities here, given the authority of state actors, whether in the legislature, whether in the executive or the judiciary. States have the obligation to design and implement laws and policies that guarantee human rights and that guarantee equality of opportunities for LGBTI persons. States must adopt approaches that seek to end harmful and restrictive practices and stereotypes that deny LGBTI persons their rights to be, their rights to love, and their rights to live in freedom. I urge all member states to ratify the Inter-American Convention against all forms of discrimination and intolerance. And in ending, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights reaffirms its commitment to fulfill its mandate as a provider of technical cooperation to all member states in this area of work. In this sense, we appreciate the support of member states for our work to promote the construction of a culture based on equality, diversity, and inclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I ask the IACHR Executive Secretariat to convey our thanks to the Rapporteur on the Rights of LGBTI Persons for her participation in today's meeting. I now ask the Secretariat to show the intervention of Secretary Mari Carmen Plata, OAS Secretary for Access to Rights and Equity. It's not a silent movie, but we will try to get her speaking. Okay, maybe while we try to correct this one, the sound, we may go to the next one, if that works better. The next one is the intervention of Mrs. Maria Fernanda Trigo, OAS Director of the Department for Effective Public Management. Let's see which one works.
Ambassadors, good afternoon. I want to talk about gender identity in ID documents, which is key for social inclusion for a vulnerable population in our region. We have been supporting this effort in the Americas through PUICA, the Universal Civil Identity Program in the Americas. Advisory Opinion 2417 of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights refers to the Universal Civil Identity Program and the right to identity, and states that a lack of recognition of identity means that a person cannot legally prove his or her existence, and that this is a violation of rights. So PUICA's work to help vulnerable populations was key, with the support of the Spanish Agency for International Development. The program has compiled and published best practices in 18 member states of the OAS and 16 states in Mexico. By analyzing the practices, we have seen that new procedures are in keeping with the standards of the Opinion 2417. Most are administrative, and they eliminate requirements that are excluding of peoples. They are expeditious and have other factors. We have also seen actions to recognize non-binary identities and procedures that are available without age limit. With respect to Mexico, for example, the number of states that have a law and procedure to recognize gender identity has progressively increased. And in 2022, there were 19 states that did this. And as of this year, it will also be available in consular offices. The program PUICA has seen that what is key to help trans people is awareness raising and training among officials that need to implement the procedures. In the 3 years, with the support of the IACHR and the Inter-American Court, as well as civil society organizations like Sinergia, in PUICA, we have trained more than 300 officials from 13 countries in the Americas. One example is the support given to the Registrar's Office in Colombia to create a module to help trans people. This has a differentiated approach, and this is a training course for all officials. This is to give officials different tools, and PUICA, together with trans organizations, protocols in Colombia and in the state of Michoacan in Mexico. Some examples of efforts that have been done in Registrar's Office to meet the needs to identify the trans population are protocols that are collaborative with civil society organizations, and also roadmaps to be able to explain the procedures to the beneficiaries. All these practices are practices that PUICA has been documenting and supporting in the region. These activities are key because we know that trans people in the Americas face generalized discrimination and barriers to health care, employment, to justice, and to political life. And also they face more violence and abuse. The lack of access to ID documents and self-perceived gender identity can contribute to violence and discrimination. ID documents are necessary on a daily basis, for example, to open or access a bank account, to get health care, to get social protection, or to register in schools. Thus, international and inter-American human rights standards that have to do with recognition of self-perceived gender identity and also access to different recommendations, services are key and need to be included in policies and procedures that favor access to legal ID for all people. Thank you.
We thank Ms. Maria Fernanda Trigo for her intervention. I don't know if we can go back to Secretary Mari Carmen Plata's intervention. Let's try again. Somehow we have no sound with it, and my lip reading is not so good. Okay, I think we have to go to the panelists. Or should we try once more? No? Okay, we'll go to the panelists then. That's unfortunate, but that's life. We can come back maybe if we ever. Dear colleagues, following the order of our agenda, we will now proceed with the presentations of our distinguished guests, beginning with the presentation of Ms. Alba Rueda, Special Representative on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, International Trade and Worship of Argentina. She will also be on video. Ms. Rueda, are you there? Welcome.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to be here and on this important day of reflection. And I will stick to the time limit that I have. I understand that we can also listen attentively to other experiences from other states. I am very proud through the Gender Identity Office in Argentina to talk about our country's experience. And if I were able to talk in depth about all policies we've developed, I would be able to go into more detail. But I do want to talk about what my country has done and what the world has done. And in my country, the unit on gender identity has been created. Only a few countries have a permanent office abroad for LGBTI plus persons. France, New Zealand, UK, the United States, we're some of the few countries that actually do have an person at ambassador rank that addresses these issues. Now, wanting to share our experiences in diversity with the rest of the world, today, what is important is a political reflection. If states do not change, if state rationale does not change by undertaking this commitment to rights that we find in the international human rights framework and have that trickle down to our domestic legislation, I think that the LGBTI communities will not be represented and will not have an impact on state policy. So I would make an appeal to make sure that political representation of LGBTI persons is a state mandate, that there needs to be policies on diversity. But what goes deeper is that states must change, and I believe that that's where we need to refer to good practices. We have a pioneering law on gender identity in Argentina, which recognizes the rights of LGBTI persons, trans and binary or non-binary specifically. In Article 12 of the law, the name of a person can be used both in the public and private spheres. And so the law urges states to allow people to change their ID to recognize it. And so we need to have policies that allow for the change in identification and administrative procedures to do so, and this is fundamental to be able to recognize all of our citizens in all their diversity. It is also vital to give people or treat people in a dignified way. This led Argentina to change information systems and statistic systems with respect to diversity, and also to link this up with the need to be identified and the specificities of our community, not only for population statistics, but also to open up what it means to be a citizen. To this end, the variable of gender awareness raising and recognition of gender identity in language is key. This year, in our census, we have included a question about gender identity. But it's not only this. We need to also measure what are the conditions in which our community lives and base thereon change policies. In 2021, we implemented through a decree, which our commissioner mentioned, and the non-binary person, instead of having male or female, you can have an X. In Argentina, this has allowed for non-conforming, binary identity, those who do not want to tell the state what their gender is, or who have fluid gender. This was an important step in the recognition of rights, moving forward with the commitments under our law on gender. At the beginning, I talked about the need to change within a state. We need to take affirmative action so that these people are recognized by all the different agencies of the state. And we have a law I mentioned that came out of a decree that was approved by President Fernandez. This was during the pandemic, and this is a fundamental policy to be able to survive the pandemic. So this was to include trans people in formal employment. This was a measure taken during the pandemic. Subsequently, in 2021, there was another law that was passed, and this was absolutely necessary so that executive, legislative agencies, etc., all branches would incentivize businesses and the federal agencies to include a specific percentage of transsexual people in their staff. This was affirmative action that addresses structural discrimination. Latin America is the most unequal region in the world, and trans people only have a life expectancy of 30 to 40 years. So we need proactive policies, beginning with those whose rights are most trampled on, and we believe that trans people need to be recognized to strengthen democracy. Thank you so much for letting me speak, and thank you again. Bye.
Thank you, Ms. Rueda, for your presentation, and we will try to go back now to the intervention by Secretary Mari Carmen Plata of SARE. Let's see if this time we can hear her clearly.
My greetings to Ambassador Shockley, Chair of the Permanent Council, to our Secretary General Luis Almagro, our Assistant Secretary General Nestor Mendez, all of the permanent representatives and delegates present at this meeting, and esteemed colleagues of the OAS. Quisiera también agradecer especialmente a la embajadora Luz Helena.
I'd also like to thank Ambassador Baños and the Permanent Mission of Mexico for leading up the LGBTI core group and for inviting me. And it's an honor to share best practices to include LGBTI persons in the Americas. And tomorrow, on November 16th, we have the International Day for Tolerance. This is an appeal for all people committed to peace and democracy in the Americas. Since 2003, we have two instruments which are instruments that make us proud. The Conventions Against Racial Discrimination, and also the Convention Against All Forms of Discrimination and Intolerance. This is the materialization of a collective effort of all member states, which allowed us to create tools to affirm and make sure that everyone is treated with dignity. But throughout the years, we see that different perspectives have left us far from allowing LGBTI people have access or full access to their rights. During the pandemic, we saw that vulnerable people were hit hard by COVID. These differences instead of separating us, should motivate us to align our efforts to recognize and address the challenges that LGBTI people face as part of our nations, communities, and families. In our secretariat, through the section on vulnerable people and through the section of civil society relations, we are committed to work with all member states to ensure that rights are for everyone, and public policies can be designed so that they favor all those people in our society and are inclusive and are based on human rights. We understand that there are vulnerable populations that exist that are discriminated against because of their sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, etc. And so the Secretariat would like to reiterate its commitment, together with the LGBTI core group, to promote the adoption and formulation of inclusive policies and practices in all member states that want to join efforts with us. In the Department of Social Inclusion and the Department of Civil Society Relations, we've worked with the core group to take measures, awareness-raising measures, and to support LGBTI people during COVID. And we have also included voices in dialogues in the hemisphere, voices that look to protect LGBTI persons. We are also supporting the development of an inclusive approach in the formulation of programs. We support, or we are a support unit within the General Secretariat of those departments that request our help so that we can have inclusive activities and programs in our member states. This is an LGBTI approach that is intersectional. We hope to help to fight against discrimination and stigmatization. We know that in the OAS there is a will to create a culture of acceptance. The Department of Social Inclusion and the Committee or Inter-American Committee of Women have been providing training to the staff of the General Secretariat to have a mainstreaming of a gender perspective and LGBTI perspective. We were able to train many people throughout the years. We also are trying to share our experiences with as many departments as possible. We want to facilitate dialogues within the OAS. And so I will not go on any further, as I know there are other speakers, but we have a collaborative, tolerant approach for all our work. We are trying to support civil society organizations that face many challenges. They face violence as well. The OAS, in keeping with the guidelines of our Secretary General, we are working for democracy, security, development, and human rights of all people in the hemisphere, regardless of their sexual orientation. We want to understand or make everyone understand the importance of acceptance. This is a path full of challenges, but we will continue to compile data and information about the challenges that LGBTI people face. And we will support policies and programs that help all people and support states to make the transformations necessary so that LGBTI people can freely express themselves in the Americas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary Mari Carmen Plata. See, if we keep on trying, we succeed. I now give the floor to Mr. Ricardo Sosa, Presidential Commissioner for Social Inclusion of Costa Rica. He will participate via Kudu. Commissioner Sosa, welcome back to the Permanent Council, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon, Ambassador Martin Chalwick, Permanent Representative of Suriname and President of the Chair of the Permanent Council, Luis Almagro, Secretary General, Ambassador Nestor Mendez, Assistant Secretary General, Ambassador Alejandra Solano, Permanent Representative of Costa Rica, Permanent Representatives of the Member States and Permanent Observers, Roberta Clark, Rapporteur for the Rights of LGBTI Persons of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, Marta Plata, Secretary for Rights and Equity, Maria Fernanda Trigo, Director of the Department for Public Management and School of Government of the OAS. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I'd like to express congratulations to the government of Mexico for its leadership in these initiatives. I feel very honored to be able to participate in this session. So I once again thank Mexico and its ambassador for this fabulous leadership. We applaud you from Costa Rica. Now, strategic and general considerations on good practices in our country with respect to the LGBTI plus community. The path that Costa Rica has followed for consolidation of the rights of the sexually diverse population attests to the solidity of its democratic institutional framework, its firm belief in the rule of law, its commitment to international human rights law, its subjecting itself to the inter-American human rights system, and above all else, its firm conviction that no one should be excluded from social progress and social inclusion. As regards promotion and protection of the rights of LGBTI plus persons, Costa Rica has a progressive position in the international community. The objective has been to go forward in the language of resolutions and declarations of intergovernmental organizations and position Costa Rica as a reference and a leader in promoting and defending the rights of the sexually diverse population. Costa Rica, through the advisory opinion requested by the state of Costa Rica, this is advisory opinion OC 24/17, was notified by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights regarding the establishment of binding parameters to ensure that LGBTI plus persons have their rights under the convention guaranteed with no discrimination whatsoever. Costa Rica drew up protocols and issued guidelines based on the advisory opinion. In 2022, the executive, via decree number 43639, established the Presidential Commissioner for Social Inclusion for indigenous Afro-descendant populations, as well as persons with disabilities and LGBTI plus persons. In addition, a mechanism of participation was established with civil society and the government called the Consultative Committee to assist in the functions of the commissioner, who coordinates and convenes the sessions of the committee. Now, in Costa Rica, as of 28 June 2018, has recognized gender equality in all official documents, administrative procedures, and databases. The privacy of communications on social networks is also protected by the resolution 15232-2019 of the Constitutional Chamber. This resolution is fundamental to avoid exposure and mockery of other persons, including the LGBTI plus population. Costa Rica has legal provisions to define hate crimes as qualified or aggravated homicide when it is because of nationality, race, age, sex, political opinion, migratory situation, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, disability or genetic characteristics. This as per law 22171 against hate crimes. Who are our main allies in the international community? Well, Costa Rica is part of the LGBTI core group, LGBTI plus core group at the OAS, and the core group, LGBTI plus, at the United Nations. These are four that make it possible to give impetus to the discussion of the issue on the different agendas of the organizations through talks, celebrations, draft resolutions, declarations, among others. Our country, as part of the UN LGBT plus core group, participated actively in the draft resolution of the Human Rights Council, which in July 2019 and in July 2022 renewed the independent expert against violence and discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity, this at the United Nations, and that independent expert is Costa Rican Victor Madrigal Borlos. As part of the OAS LGBTI core group, Costa Rica became chair pro tem from January 1st to June 30th, 2022, on which occasion it focused the work of this group on supporting regional efforts to eliminate the criminalization of homosexuality. Our country is a member of the Equal Rights Coalition, known as the ERC. This is an intergovernmental organization that has 42 member states and organizations of civil society. The objective is to promote the rights of LGBTI plus persons worldwide. Costa Rica joined the 2021-2026 strategic plan. Recognition of gender identity in all official documents, administrative procedures, and databases. As I mentioned, this happened in 2018 through Executive Decree 41173 MP. For the first time, the executive recognized the gender identity of persons. And by the decree, the decree regulates the adaptation of the name, image or picture, and reference to sex or gender of the person on all types of documents. And in all types of records and administrative procedures of the public administration as per their own sexual and gender identity. We have, and I want to note this last analysis as a function and a duty of obligation that is being implemented. And here I'm talking about the economic rights of the sexually diverse community. It's very important is the right to a pension for same-sex couples. As of 30 June 2016, the board of directors of the Costa Rican Social Security Fund approved extending the that death benefits could also go to the person, and it recommended in same-sex persons and entrusted the pension management to undertake a modification to the respective regulations. Today, we're working for the integration and institutional inclusion with respect of the human rights of the population in defense of vulnerable populations. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Commissioner Sosa, for your presentation. And I now give the floor to Mr. Edgar Fielma, General Director of Social Demographic Statistics at the National Institute of Statistics and Geography of Mexico. Mr. Fielma, welcome, and you have the floor.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to participate in this forum organized by the Organization of American States, the OAS. I extend greetings to the Secretary General, to all the members, and to the coordinator of this event, our Ambassador of Mexico. And I'm most grateful for this invitation and the opportunity to share the good practices that Mexico has implemented in this area. Now, first, as the National Statistics Office, our first comment is that giving visibility, or the effort that this office has made to begin with the basic element of a narrative, of a story. That is to say, what is the population we're talking about? What are the conditions of that population and its characteristics? And to that end, the National Statistics Office of Mexico, the INEGI, about 6 years ago, undertook to develop and identify the appropriate instrument for giving visibility to the LGBTI plus population, or more specifically, the population 15 years and older with a gender identity or with an unconventional gender identity or sexual orientation. To this end, the National Statistics Office undertook a thorough literature review as well as a review of scientific analysis, where we first had to determine what would be the appropriate instrument for giving visibility to that population. In other words, we have different sources of information in the national offices, whether it's censuses, administrative records, surveys, or the statistics that are derived therefrom. Nonetheless, each of these sources of information has its strengths and weaknesses. In our case, our office discarded each one, which instead of giving visibility would do just the opposite when it came the opposite of seeking such a visualization. In other words, those whose method may be very effective for a given objective, but would generate the opposite of the expected result in other respects. And so censuses were approved. Recall that censuses worldwide generally, well, our informant is an indirect person in relation to the specific issue we might be investigating or researching. Censuses are characteristic by a basic characteristic, which is a population count, generically speaking, without getting into specialization with certain subcategories or subject areas. And these can become so complex that the informant or declarant who we have in front of us might not know that. So that initial instrument was evaluated. We observed the methodology and the major under-registration that it would entail, not because in the case of Mexico, there's 35 million households. It doesn't mean it's going to be the most precise instrument. Indeed, such instruments, because of their methodology, could turn out to be counterproductive. We checked the administrative records, where we also know that for where there's generally under-registration, we then checked out the third component, which are surveys. And in that area, for the last 50 years, several studies have been undertaken. Some are non-probabilistic surveys, which, while they have helped put the topic on the agenda, they didn't necessarily reflect the reality of a given population. And then the research continued. We moved on to surveys, especially health surveys, which has generally incorporated this subject matter as a secondary subject matter, and therefore it has resulted in major under-registration. Now, in Mexico, following this literature and experiments undertaken with scientific method, we discarded each of them until we came up with a unique specialized instrument which has as its main objective giving visibility. Then it could also measure education, health, and other issues. But as secondary questions, because the very essence of that statistical instrument was to give visibility to the LGBTI plus population. In that regard, through a questionnaire with a narrative, with adequate tools for isolating the person of both the questions we asked and those external to this person, one who might be listening, what was asked was through mobile devices with earphones and without us knowing what the person's answered, well, a questionnaire was implemented that was also constructed based on a life history and a narrative which gave us a figure that is much closer to the reality compared to what we got from the other methods. For example, in 2017, following international practice in health or discrimination surveys with a secondary inquiry on sexual orientation and gender identity, Mexico came up with a figure of nearly 2%, which was the half of what one finds in most of the countries, between 1 and 1.3% of the population that is self-recognized itself as such, but based on a highly specialized instrument and in an adequate context for its implementation, as I mentioned, in the case that we ourselves didn't even know how for the question of self-recognition, well, person would fill it out in a mobile device in isolation, and they were told that the person who was looking at them or who they had, the surveyor, would not know the answer. And so instead of 1.2 million, then we came up with 5 million people, which is 5.1% of the population. So it was a major change based on when we drew on the results of a specialized instrument. And that is what Mexico is calling for, that there be methodological and scientific rigor in order to really figure out how to measure and give visibility to this. The example we have is that in some free text that persons told us this was the very first time in their life that someone from outside would ask them about their sexual orientation, gender identity. In some cases, people were crying when they told us this. So these are very sensitive and complex processes. And if they're addressed inappropriately, well, the first thing is, well, then the identification of the population is problematic. And from there, labor, education, freedoms, and all of these issues are going to be suspended because of the fact that one will not have identified the complete population. So what Mexico has done in its 2021 exercise, the National Survey on Sexual Orientation and Gender Diversity, SOGI, it disrupted, it was a disruptor with the adequate approach to better gauge the reality in the case of Mexico. And we would be pleased to share that methodology with you, given the experience that we've seen, the empirical experience we've seen in some other countries. So Mexico is happy to meet with the national statistics offices of the other countries to achieve this objective. So in conclusion, what has stemmed from these kinds of exercises? Well, for conversion therapies, for example, in the legislature and based on information such as this, it's made it possible to adopt laws to fight such practices. It's also made it possible to develop elements for electoral participation in Mexico, among many other public policy factors, which are now being based on investigative or survey instruments such as this. Thank you so much and have an excellent afternoon.
For this good presentation on the methodology, which is of interest. I now give the floor to Mr. Stefano Fabeni, Executive Director of Synergia.
Muchísimas gracias, señor presidente del Consejo.
Thank you very much, distinguished Chairman Shalwick of the Permanent Council, Secretary General Luis Almagro, Assistant Secretary General Nestor Mendez. I would like to thank all of the missions of the member countries, and I'd like to congratulate in particular the mission of Mexico and Ambassador Baños for having organized this session and the invitation today. In my presentation, I'm going to speak a bit about the regulatory and administrative framework in the Americas, or legal administrative framework in the Americas, as to good practices in terms of such provisions, legal and administrative. This as per the information that we have collected from the LGBTI coalition and sex workers in the Americas, work that was done at the OAS. Now, despite all the challenges that exist in this region, this hemisphere has developed the largest number of best practices for protection and promotion of the rights of LGBTI plus persons. So I apologize if I cannot obviously address all of the good practices in the region. And I'd also like to note, as Secretary Maria Carmen Plata indicated earlier, that there's also at the OAS, for example, the Inter-American Convention Against All Forms of Intolerance, Discrimination and Intolerance, the cooperation agreement that we signed in February with the Secretary General between the coalition and the Organization of American States. There are practices multilaterally in the framework of the OAS as well that should be highlighted. But I'd also like to highlight some and focus on the normative practices of the states that have been useful for civil society, with a focus on protection for LGBTQ plus persons, recognition of family and legal recognition of gender identity, as well as the situation of persons called intersex persons. Obviously, much of the work, all of the good practices have been developed mostly through civil society advocacy, and we see that during this period, thanks to the advocacy of civil society in the Caribbean, as part of a strategic and holistic effort by civil society, legal strategy, a strategy for communication, security, advocacy, and attention for mental health. We see how through the judiciary laws that criminalize consensual sexual acts between persons of the same sex are being repealed in various countries. Obviously, there's also a constitutional framework, countries such as Ecuador and Bolivia, which recognize the prohibition on discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity in their constitutions. And many countries have implemented non-discriminatory frameworks by the adoption of hate crime statutes. But the most important thing, this is often not enough to guarantee a substantive struggle against impunity. And so there are good practices such as, for example, the creation of offices for handling diversity in state institutions in the framework of the justice system, for example, creating specialized prosecutorial offices to address crimes committed against LGBTQI plus persons. This has happened in various states of Mexico, or, for example, in the state of Chihuahua, which has an office of special prosecutor for human rights defenders and journalists, which has also undertaken investigations into homicides of trans persons. Mention was already made of the prohibition of states to fight efforts to correct sexual orientation and gender identity. What have been called conversion therapies have been prohibited in several countries of the hemisphere. I'd also like to highlight here that it's important not only to adopt criminal statutes, but also to prevent and punish discrimination, not only through criminal statutory provisions, but by means of, or with other sanctions as well. I am pleased that there was talk of the role of the census, and we believe in civil society that political participation of LGBTIQ plus persons, such as the guideline for nomination for political office, at least to ensure that there are candidacies that include persons who represent this diversity, in particular trans persons, is so important for being able to actually ensure that public policies have an impact. For example, the fact that we have our colleague Alba Rueda in her position, these are extremely important practices. As regards family, mention was made earlier about same-sex marriage. It is clearly a major accomplishment as regards recognition of economic and social rights within the family, as well as property rights. But in addition, best practices also include access to reproductive technologies, adoption with no restrictions based on social orientation, gender identity, civil status, or in the case of Argentina, noting the will for procreation as which would not only recognize LGBTIQ persons, but also would protect women who are victims of sexual violence who don't want to recognize the child. There was already mention was already made of Advisory Opinion 24 of 2017, so I'm not going to dwell on that point. But also, Alba highlighted the fact that the law itself is not sufficient to make reparation for the socioeconomic gaps suffered by trans persons. So the law on trans quota mentioned by Alba Rueda is fundamental, as well as Uruguay's experience, which recognizes a reparations regime for trans persons who have been victims of institutional violence and or trans persons who have been deprived of liberty due to their gender identity. Finally, mention was made of the good practice of what we have done with QICA in the context of the OAS and having recognition in identity documents to ensure recognition, say, of non-binary persons. Even though the X as a marker is often not enough to avoid discrimination, because the X can also give a certain visibility. For example, the good practice of Honduras, always in the context of the work that was done with QICA, well, now they don't have a marker on their national identity document. In addition, as a matter of public policy, as for example in Guatemala, the comprehensive differential health program for trans persons, to mention one other country, there are many others, as well as protocols in favor of LGBTI persons who have been deprived of liberty, protocols for their attention, protocols for intimate visits as between persons of the same sex in the area of education, provisions that allow for the use of the name that people use in their social lives. All of these are measures that help LGBTI persons in their day-to-day lives. Here, I would like to conclude, first of all, highlighting the importance, for example, of when there is supervision of compliance with treaty obligations, coming back to the OAS, the possibility of applying supervision of treaty compliance without it going to the courts by state officials, and ensure that this whole wealth of good practices can be shared through efforts to have learning and technical cooperations as among the countries, which the OAS could facilitate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Fabeni, for your presentation. And I now give the floor to Mr. Mark Siegel. He will join us through Kudo. Mr. Siegel, are you there? Welcome to the Permanent Council, and you have the floor.
Mr. Siegel, can you kindly request the floor, please?
Chairman, Secretary General, ambassadors, member of the Permanent Council, allies, lesbian LGBT core group, Mexican mission, and Mexican ambassador, and esteemed guests. Thank you for the opportunity to speak before you today. I will be speaking about one word. In order to tell you what that one word is, I have to explain that I was born in 1951. That means today that I am 71 years old. That also means that I grew up in the 1950s and the 1960s. And during that time, once I knew that I was a gay man, I knew that I was invisible. Growing up at that time, I also was told that I was immoral, illegal, unemployable, and psychologically disturbed. If I tried to find out anything about myself, I'd have to go only to a library, since we were not allowed on TV, radio, magazines, or newspaper, and there was no internet. And in the library, I would find out that I was, quote, psychologically disturbed in need of psychiatric care. That is why at the age of 18, I moved from my city, Philadelphia, a city of 1.6 million people, because I felt that I was the only gay man in that city. I moved to New York, where I was without a job, a home, or prospects for the future. But I did what every 18-year-old did at that time. Every 18-year-old wants to dance. And so every night I went to a bar in New York called the Stonewall. And some of you might know LGBT history. And on June 27th, 1969, I was in that bar when the police barged in, broke the doors down, began to take axes to the bar, throwing the bottles of liquor around, slamming people up against the wall, throwing every profanity you could imagine. I'd never seen such violence in my life before. My initial reaction was, quick, I better call the police. And then I realized this was the police who were doing this. My second reaction was, it's 1969. It is the top of the countercultural years in the United States. Women are fighting for their rights. People of color are fighting for their rights. The Latino community is fighting for their rights. When do we start fighting for our rights and equality? That led me with others to form the Gay Liberation Front. From the ashes of Stonewall came Gay Liberation Front, the first organization which would help us self-identify. And also our motto at that time was out, loud, and proud. Each of those words is very important for what we are doing here today, because each one of them represents that one word, visibility. By being out, not in the closet, I was a representative of the LGBT community. By being loud, I made sure the general public saw me. And by being proud, I showed people there was nothing to be ashamed of to be LGBT. For me, that led to a lifelong fight for visibility. And in 1975, I got the opportunity to meet with Governor Milton Schaap of Pennsylvania. Governor Milton Schaap in 1975 became the first elected official in the United States of America to meet with members of the LGBT community and to discuss what could be done to help their situation. Governor Schaap created the first executive order to state that you cannot discriminate against gay men and lesbian women in state government. That was the first executive order of its type, not just in Pennsylvania, not just in the United States, but in the world. He then went on to create the Governor's Council for Sexual Minorities, which also had liaisons to every governmental department, ambassadors, general secretaries. You are an outgrowth of that visibility, because what you are doing here today is giving visibility and voice to the LGBT community. Therefore, your roots go back to those works by Governor Shapp in 1975. And I thank you for continuing to bring visibility, because you are a continuous link. Best practices for how to bring social services to each of their constituents. That is especially important to LGBT youth, so they never feel like I did in 1950s. They will no longer feel alone and invisible, but proud. That invisible 18-year-old me standing outside the Stonewall Bar in 1969 could have never expected speaking to the Permanent Council of the OAS today. I thank you for your time. Again, I am honored and humbled to be here. And if there's anything I can do in the future to help your work, just call.
Thank you, Mr. Mark Siegel. To conclude our presentations, we will now have Mr. Felipe Cardenas, President of the LGBT Chamber of Commerce of Colombia. Mr. Cardenas, welcome to the Permanent Council, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Chairman, Secretary General, representatives, ambassadors, and special guests at this special session. I'm very honored to be here. And during the next few minutes, I want to talk about the 10 years I've been at the helm of the LGBT Chamber of Commerce of Colombia. It's a private undertaking and has been supported by some of the embassies in Colombia. At that time, Colombia did not protect sexually diverse persons, and we did not have equality with other citizens. In other words, equal rights protection. But since 2012, we brought this idea to the country because we were the first trade group that came before the state, and according to our statistics agency, there are 2 million of us who are LGBT persons in Colombia. So we opted for economic empowerment. And so how are we going to look for our rights? Well, through economic empowerment, because that way we were less it was less probable we would be victims of physical abuse or verbal abuse or violence. Many Colombians have died, and migrants as well, because of their sexual diversity. Working with the private sector, we have compiled an array of best practices, and so I'd like to share with you what our experience has been throughout these years. And we know the importance of the private sector, the enterprises in the Americas. They have brought in diverse people in the economy. We were convinced that by 2030, we must evolve with respect to LGBT rights in member states. In some states, this has gone faster than in other places, but these rights that we see in our constitutions and in our regulations, they need to go from theory to practice. In many member states today, diverse people we can adopt, we can marry, we can have an ID document which reflects our gender identity. In some member states, we have anti-discrimination laws which should protect our life and limb, and public policies that are national, regional, or local, which are supporting the recognition of these rights. But this is not a guarantee that we have a place to live, that we could study, that we can eat, and that we can have full lives. So that's why our message is economic empowerment. And we've been doing this for 10 years. This is the right arm of social activism to fight for LGBT rights in Colombia and the Americas, because this is the economic empowerment arm. The private sector can play an important role in ensuring the full exercise of our rights. We're doing this in two ways. First, by strengthening workplaces that are free of discrimination. We're working through large companies, multinationals, SMEs at a local level, so that they have conducts, recruitment, and training, and working through HR, procurement, and through those that supply technology, so we can eliminate bias with respect to sexual orientation. Let's understand the regulation and normative framework on sexual diversity, but let's go forward with a change in corporate culture which allows us to have workplaces that are free of discrimination. As we have more and more safer workplaces, we have more formal workplaces that include sexually diverse people in our states and other states. At the same time, as we are promoting access to formal work, we're also promoting scaling up of entrepreneurs and startups, because we want to encourage entrepreneurs so that they formalize their businesses and can build value chains. And so we want to increase the income of diverse people in our countries so that economic empowerment means they can fend for themselves and they can have a dignified life and are less likely to be victims of discrimination. So we believe that the role of the private sector in Colombia and other countries is very important. It can accelerate the implementation, the assertion of rights of diverse people. To conclude, we believe that first, discriminate is the worst thing a business could do, because you're losing talent and human capital, which can strengthen competitive enterprises. We will not be reaching the 2030 objectives or our economic development if we leave people out. So the state and businesses need to empower all diverse people. That's what our chamber is doing in Colombia and with other associated chambers in other countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cardenas, for the interesting presentation. And we now give the floor to member states, the delegations who would like to make a statement. But let me remember you that you will have it will be limited to 5 minutes each. And also look at what we are dealing with. It's best practices. So we hope that you can contribute some to that. The floor is open for participation, and I see a lot of countries have asked the floor already. Colombia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to thank you for convening this with the support of the Mexican mission that coordinates the core LGBTI group. And we understand this is in keeping with the mandate of the 52nd General Assembly. I would like to greet Roberta Clark, the rapporteur for LGBTI persons at the IACHR, and all the panelists who have participated this afternoon. I'd like to highlight the participation of Felipe Cardenas, who we just heard from, president of the LGBT Chamber of Commerce of Colombia, who gave us a really refreshing perspective from the private sector about how to promote diversity, inclusion, and equality. With respect to best practices, my country has a roadmap to ensure the right to diversity. This seeks to include lesbians, gays, bisexuals, trans, intersex people, and queer people. The idea is to overcome inequality, stigma, and fight against discrimination and violence in order to continue to consolidate democracy that is equal and respectful of human dignity. The roadmap is based on public policies that want to reaffirm gender identity and sexual orientation without barriers for all trans and non-binary people, to include them in society and work in the education sector where they feel safe and free from violence. At the same time, we have a national program of safe cities free of violence and discrimination against people and those who have diverse sexual and gender orientation. We believe gender orientation and sexual orientation cannot be a reason for violence or attacks in a democratic society where there is a rule of law. The government of Colombia is also seeking to go forward in the real recognition of same-sex couples and their rights to Social Security and adoption. At the same time, the health system will support, using a psychosocial and medical approach, the transition from one gender to another, and this will be available for trans people. The Colombian state believes it is important to give visibility to the violence that has been based on gender in the armed conflict. We must ensure reparation, justice, truth, and non-repetition. The system for truth, non-repetition, and justice in Colombia has a gender perspective and also has been working to have a differentiated approach in its cases to stop re-victimization. Progressively, we have included LGBTI people in this process. The efforts for justice have shown that people from the LGBTI community were victims because the discrimination against this community because of sexual orientation or gender expression, which is a grave violation of human rights. And finally, I will cite our Vice President of Multilateral Affairs, who spoke at the last GA. She said that the peace policy in Colombia has an LGBT face, and we will continue to defend their rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Colombia. I now give the floor to Chile.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Very much, Chair. As one of the member states of the core group, we thank you for convening this meeting, and we also thank the panelists for their presentations. We thank their presentations not only out of politeness, but those who have spoke show that we are facing a common challenge. Inclusion of those who are from the LGBTI community, because there is not one state that can say that it has been able to fulfill LGBTI people's rights. So for many years they have suffered victimization, discrimination, mistreatment. Commissioner Clark recalled that many times traditional values were used to justify this discrimination and violations of human rights. In Chile, we have taken some steps. They are insufficient, but they are important. And allow me to cite three of those. First of all, the law for equal marriage, which recognizes the right of kinship of same-sex couples, the gender identity law, which defines this as a conviction that one is a man or a woman, and this may not be in keeping with the gender at birth. And also the integral law on children, where it states no child or adolescent can be discriminated against based on their sex, sexual orientation, gender expression, or gender identity. Now, with respect to our history, we know that with each step we take, there is so far to go still. As a best practice in Chile, we stated in May, on the Day Against Transphobia and Homophobia, we have a forum for LGBTI plus people where the government and civil society organizations can meet and work on plans and policies. We've had the participation of 34 civil society organizations that belong to different regions of the country, and they had worked together with the legislative branch and executive agencies. So we are promoting different bills which are before Congress, the reform of the anti-discrimination law and the law to prevent school harassment. And also we're working on three fundamental pillars, work, violence, or healthcare without violence or discrimination. There is no state that can assert that is fully complied with its mission, but we are all trying to move forward in this based on our experience. We need to include those who have suffered this kind of discrimination and violence. It's the only way we can fully respect their human rights, by having them included in this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I'll give the floor to the Ambassador of Canada.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, colleagues. Let me start by thanking all of the panelists who were able to present to us this afternoon, to Commissioner Roberta Clark and to Secretary Mary Carmen Plata as well, our thanks. And let me send a special word of thanks to the Ambassador of Mexico and to her mission for their leadership today, but also on this issue in general, for which we are very grateful. Chair, as OAS member states, we've all recognized that human rights are universal and indivisible. When states fail to protect the full rights of their LGBTI citizens, this creates fertile ground for intolerance, discrimination, violence, and exclusion, ultimately causing harm to LGBTI persons and the communities and economies in which they live. It's critical that we continue to advance human rights for LGBTI persons. Chair, you asked us to identify a few best practices. Let me try my best to meet your request with 4, and the 4th one will have some sub-practices to that as well. First, increasing visibility, and this picks up on a comment that Mark Siegel said so eloquently, I thought, this afternoon. it's important for us to take steps to increase visibility. I'll give one example of a best practice that we've adopted. Canada was the first country to collect and publish data on gender diversity from a national census. Canada is home to approximately 1 million people who are LGBTQ+, accounting for 4% of the population aged 15 and older as of 2018. Nearly 30.5 million people in Canada living in a private household. Of that number, 100,000 roughly were transgender, and a bit more than 40,000 non-binary, accounting for 0.33% of the population. I point this out again just as an example of taking steps to give visibility. Second best practice, righting past wrongs. The Canadian government formally apologized to LGBTI Canadians for past systemic discrimination and persecution, a very ugly and unhappy part of our history, and expunged and destroyed criminal records for people who had been convicted of consensual same-sex activity when that was a crime in Canada. Third best practice, as noted by Commissioner Clark, Canada passed laws to ban so-called conversion therapy and to provide explicit protection from discrimination, hate speech, and hate crimes, so ensuring legal protection, another best practice. And a fourth best practice, which I'll elaborate on very briefly, but it'll take me a moment, and others have spoken to this as well, it's planning for the future. A few months ago in August, Canada launched an historic and collaborative federal 2SLGBTQI+ action plan. This sets out a number of concrete commitments and charts a path to advance rights and equality for 2SLGBTQI+ persons in Canada and abroad as well. And I want to touch briefly on that for just a moment, Chair, because there's a few best practices in that plan itself. The first one's in the name itself, and I want to take a moment on that because I'd said 2SLGBTQI+ communities. That acronym was adopted based on consultations, extensive consultations, meant to be a more inclusive term that places 2S or two-spirit persons at the forefront in honor and recognition of Indigenous 2SLGBTQI+ communities as the first 2SLGBTQI+ peoples in North America. I'm going to continue in French, Chair. En second lieu, cela concerne le processus de rédaction de...
We also must draw up plans of actions, and we must include the LGBTQI communities. The Canadian government has engaged with the community, and we have received 25,000 responses to a survey, and we've had round tables. The plan of actions and policies are also supported by $25 million over 5 years in order to give priority to community organizations that represent LGBTI people in community initiatives. This is an engagement to identify new initiatives once it is implemented. To conclude, I'm so glad that many of our partners in the hemisphere are developing similar frameworks and have implemented laws and policies that are inclusive. For example, in Argentina or Mexico, that has prohibited conversion therapy, or the law that ensures same-sex marriage in Costa Rica, just to give you some examples. As we are celebrating the International Day of Tolerance tomorrow, we need to look at tolerance writ large, which means respect, appreciation, and pride in rich diversity of the people who come from the LGBTI community. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador. We give the floor now to Mr. Aurimar Nunes from Brazil. I think he's speaking.
Obrigado, Sr. Presidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd like to congratulate Ambassador Lucilena Baño Rivas, Permanent Representative of Mexico, for having called this session of the Permanent Council devoted entirely to best practices for inclusion of LGBTI persons in the Americas. As coordinator of the LGBTI core group of the OAS, of which Brazil is a founding member. I'd also like to express gratitude for the presentations that we have heard this afternoon by the panelists, and also all of the remarks that have been made thus far by the member states. I also recall that Brazil is a member of the LGBTI core group, not just in this organization, but also at the United Nations in New York and Geneva. Mr. Chairman, as you requested, I am going to ask permission to present and list some of Brazil's good practices in respect of the inclusion of LGBTI persons and the defense of their rights. In 2011, in Brazil, civil union between persons of the same sex was recognized as a family, constitutionally protected. 2 years later, in 2013, it was determined that all Brazilian notarial offices have the obligation to hold a marriage or to marry persons between the same sex. Also, 2 years later, in 2015, the right to adopt children by same-sex couples was recognized. Now, 4 years ago, as of 2018, every Brazilian citizen has the right to choose how they wish to be called and to alter their name and sex in the Brazilian Civil Registry, independent of sexual redesignation surgeries, which moreover are have been regulated in Brazil since 1997. In 2019, homophobia was criminalized in Brazil based on our anti-racism legislation. In addition, in the area of the Brazilian executive, the government has been according priority to policies for fighting discrimination and violence against LGBTI persons. Also, several measures have been adopted to support economic inclusion and employability of that part of the population, especially of trans persons. Finally, the Ministry of Women, Family, and Human Rights today has specific guidelines on LGBTI persons to develop and implement policies in that area. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Nunes. And I give the floor to Bolivia.
Chairman, Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen, ambassadors. First, I would like to greet the Permanent Mission of Mexico, very especially our friend and ambassador, Lucilena Baño Rivas, as coordinator of the LGBTI core group of the OAS, and the delegations that make it up for holding this special session of the Permanent Council on best practices for inclusion of LGBTI persons in the Americas. We're grateful for the presentations by the experts, which show us that the path to true protection of the rights of vulnerable groups is a long one. Nonetheless, the sharing of experiences among our countries helps us to continue strengthening our work in this noble task. There can be no greater aspiration of humanity than the search for equality among all human rights, recognizing ourselves as equals beyond the color of our skin, beyond our race, beyond our status, beyond our origins, has been indeed for so long the history of humankind. Now we must recognize ourselves as equals beyond our gender condition and our preferences. We have diversity, we must have absolute and total tolerance as the basis of a better society for the lives of all human beings going forward. Mr. Chairman, along these lines, Bolivia established plurality and diversity as fundamental aspects to their most intrinsic structures. We have gone beyond monocentric conceptions. We have gone to recognizing all diversities in all areas of society and the state. Our Constitution prohibits and punishes all forms of discrimination based on sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity, and guarantees that persons can exercise their sexual rights and their reproductive rights. In 2010, when I had the honor to be Speaker of the lower house in Bolivia, one of the most important laws of the new state was approved. This is the law against racism and all forms of discrimination, which includes the LGBTI population as right holders whose rights are to be protected, and punishing discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation or gender identity, as well as all of the hate crimes based on this reason. In 2013, the law or 2003, the law on youth was adopted. This recognizes the rights of the youth in various areas, including education, respecting in particular their sexual orientation and gender identity. In the family sphere in 2014, the Code of Families and Family Process was adopted. Families, in the plural, which represented a major stride forward in terms of relationships as in the couple and as in the family without any discrimination or hatred. In the area of health, since 2007, access to and universal health care is recognized for all persons who live in the national territory. This implies that no economic, social, cultural, sexual orientation, gender identity, sexual occupation, or its circumstance of persons living with HIV/AIDS could justify discriminatory treatment or the denial of medical services. In 2012, the general law for persons with disabilities was adopted. It puts in place mechanisms to guarantee persons with different discapacities the full exercise of their rights and duties on an equal footing, including sexual and reproductive rights. In 2014, the Code on the Child and Adolescent was adopted, which establishes and sanctions or punishes discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity in the educational system, among other advances that incorporate and recognize constitutional principles against discrimination against children and adolescents. In 2016, law on gender identity was adopted, and this is perhaps the most important of all because it allows transgender and transsexual persons to change their name, sex, and image in all documents through a simple administrative process, allowing them to exercise their rights to personality and identity with no restriction or limitation. Mr. Chairman, from a regional perspective, we see that the Inter-American human rights system has also made major strides in recent years. For example, Advisory Opinion 24/17, handed down by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, by which it notes that sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression are categories that are protected by the American Convention on Human Rights, and it highlights fundamentally the duty of all states to adopt all measures necessary to ensure equal access without discrimination to a broad list of rights for this population, which historically has suffered discrimination and stigmatization. Similarly, there were major advances in the rapporteurship on the rights of LGBTI persons of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights through the reports on violence against LGBTI persons in the Americas 2015, on advances and challenges towards as regards the rights of LGBTI persons 2019, and on persons who are trans and of gender diversity and their economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights report of 2020. Chairman, no doubt the path to go forward to attain full equality and the elimination of all forms of discrimination among human beings is still lengthy and tortuous. Nonetheless, with initiatives such as this, we will reach our objective. Once again, we congratulate and acknowledge the Ambassador of Mexico and all of the members of this important group. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Bolivia, and I give the floor to the United States.
Great, thank you, Chair, Secretary General, and Assistant Secretary General. My name is Jay Gilliam. I use pronouns he, him, his, and I am the Senior LGBTQI+ Coordinator at the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID. At the outset, and on behalf of the U.S. delegation, the United States applauds the topic and timeliness of today's session on best practices for the inclusion of LGBTI persons in the Americas, marking the International Day of Tolerance. A special thank you to the OAS LGBTI Core Group, which the U.S. is proud to be a member of, and to Mexico and Ambassador Luz Elena Baños Rivas for convening this special meeting. It's also excellent to see the participation of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights Rapporteur on the Rights of LGBTI persons and the Special Representative from Argentina. It's also great to see trusted civil society partners, Stefano from Synergia, Felipe from the Chamber, and Mark, a journalist and activist. Thank you for being visibly proud and leading this work from civil society. I would like to begin by observing that this is an exciting moment in the region. The past several months, we have seen moves toward decriminalization of same-sex relations in Antigua and Barbuda, in St. Kitts and Nevis, banning of so-called conversion therapy practices, as well as national marriage equality in Mexico, and Chile issuing the first gender-neutral ID card, allowing non-binary persons to have an X marker for gender on their identity for the first time in the country. The U.S. government is proud to see these advancements for the rights of LGBTQI+ persons in the region. We also understand the importance to listening and learning from you all, as we can take your lessons for our own continued work to advance LGBTQI+ rights in the United States, particularly for those most marginalized, like Black and brown trans women. For a little background, USAID is active in over 100 countries globally and is the U.S. government's lead development and humanitarian assistance agency. We're proud to have missions across the region that enable us to develop strong partnerships with governments, development practitioners, and civil society. As Senior LGBTQI+ Coordinator, I've been tasked by USAID Administrator Samantha Power and the Biden-Harris administration to work with colleagues in Washington and USAID missions around the world to advance LGBTQI+ inclusive development. As a crucial focus of today's discussion on the importance of intersectionality, the United States is advancing a vision of inclusive development that sees the full person, not merely sexual orientation, not merely gender identity and expression, but all of the factors that compose an individual's complex and unique self, so that we support programs that break down the barriers that leave individuals in vulnerable situations. For USAID, in addition to recognizing the multiple intersecting aspects of individuals' identities, we know engaging LGBTQI+ people throughout the development process just leads to better outcomes. So, what does this mean in practice exactly? Well, let me give you an example. My first trip abroad as Senior LGBTQI+ Coordinator was to our USAID mission in Honduras this past summer. I went to participate in a workshop with local Honduran organizations, including several that work to address gender-based violence against LGBTQI+ persons. Based on recent analyses, 2 of the most prevalent forms of gender-based violence contributing to irregular migration are intimate partner violence and gender-based violence against LGBTQI+ persons. While there, I announced new support from USAID to local organizations to strengthen their capacity in responding to gender-based violence against LGBTQI+ persons. Our work also includes training USAID staff and implementing partners on LGBTQI+ inclusion and USAID's workplace and programs. The United States also understands the importance of LGBTQI+ data in shaping the narratives of our lives. For example, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, based off marketing survey data, the US media cultivated the idea of gay affluence, or gay couples who had high disposable incomes. However, those marketing surveys had skewed samples. Most respondents were white, cisgender men in urban cities. not people like me and my transgender siblings of color from the American South. It wasn't until we could get better data reflecting the full diversity of our communities that a clearer picture of the economic disparities among LGBTQI+ people were apparent. This data enabled the movement to have more control over the stories of our lives and strengthened the way we advocated. So I appreciated hearing what Mexico is doing to collect data about LGBTQI+ persons there. That's very important work that needs to be shared more. Since 2016, USAID has also supported the United Nations Development Program's Being LGBTI in the Caribbean, which is an initiative that funds LGBTQI+-led organizations, supports legal and policy reform, and collects data on the lived realities of LGBTQI+ persons across the region. For example, last year, Being LGBTI in the Caribbean launched a first-of-its-kind report on the human rights of intersex persons in Barbados, Dominican Republic, Haiti, and Jamaica. The program recently supported a multi-stakeholder roundtable in Barbados.
Sir, you have 6 minutes already, so please wrap up.
Yes, thank you. So to end, I just want to share a reflection on a recent trip to Mexico. Through the efforts of YA, a local organization, the Victory Institute, and the National Democratic Institute, they convened a training of LGBTQI+ leaders who want to run for political office. 50+ leaders participated from nearly every Mexican state across political parties, genders, and generations who want to take their experiences from civil society to inside the government to continue to make change. And it included political leaders from across the region who led this training. This is going to be the first of 5 trainings that are going to be happening across the region. And I think this is just one example of the talent, expertise, and excitement of the LGBTQI+ movement in the region, and the changes that are being led from civil society, governments, and multilateral institutions like OAS. The U.S. has already learned so much from this group, and today we look forward to engaging even more with you all. I can't wait to see progress continue to advance LGBTQI+ rights across the region, and thank you once more for having me today at the OAS Permanent Council for this special meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, United States, and I give the floor to Peru.
Thank you, Chair. We welcome Mexico's initiative to hold this special session, and we are also grateful for the valuable presentations that have been made this afternoon, which allow us to go forward in our objective, our common objective of giving visibility to best practices for protecting the rights of the LGBTI population of the region. In the case of Peru, the Constitution recognizes the right to identity, moral, psychological, and physical integrity, and the free development and well-being of all citizens. Likewise, it guarantees the principle of equality as between the law and the prohibition of discrimination on the grounds of sex or any other sort. Also, the National Human Rights Plan considers LGBTI persons as a group to be specially protected that requires the adoption of specific public policies aimed at improving the situation of the exercise of their human rights, establishing 3 strategic objectives: guarantee the enjoyment of a life without discrimination and violence, guarantee recognition of the gender identity of trans persons, and guarantee access to health services for LGBTI persons according priority to the main problems that affect them. In 2016, the working roundtables were established in our country in order to address on a differentiated basis the situation of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transsexual persons. And over time, this has become a forum for dialogue between the state and civil society with a view to coming up with proposals to raise awareness to fight the discrimination affecting this sector of the population. In addition, Peru must highlight the contributions of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, such as the recent visit by Commissioner Roberta Clark to Lima in April of this year to participate in the event organized by the Program for Universal Civil Identity in the Americas, OAS program, with the support of Synergy Initiatives for Human Rights, in a workshop entitled Sub-Regional Workshop for South America on Recognition of Gender Identity. In addition, on that occasion, Commissioner Clark presented the report on trans and gender diverse persons and their economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights. We must not fail to mention the mandate of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which on November 3rd, 2022, the Peruvian state undertook a ceremony for recognition of international responsibility and public apologies to Azul Rojas Marin, a transgender Peruvian woman, for violating rights set forth in the American Convention on Human Rights during her detention by the National Police of Peru in 2008. This is no doubt a historic event of a sort never carried out by the Peruvian state. During the public apologies in this case, the Ministry of Justice and Human Rights announced the formation of a technical team to draw up a protocol for investigations and administration of justice during criminal proceedings in cases of LGBTI persons who have been victims of violence. Chairman, Peru would like to highlight that in the latest general elections in 2021 and in the recent regional and municipal elections last October 2nd, the National Office of Electoral Processes approved and set in motion the protocol for guaranteeing the right to the vote for trans persons in elections. It also distributed a guide for interaction with trans persons at the voting table in order to avoid discriminatory practices and practices that might violate the right to vote of trans persons. No doubt this is a best practice that evidences Peru's commitment to ensure full respect for human rights and the principle of equality before the law and non-discrimination in respect of LGBTI persons in our country. We issue an appeal to all the member states to continue working together against inequality and discrimination. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peru, and I give the floor to Argentina.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Chairman. The Argentine position has already been presented by Ambassador Albarrueda, and it's also well known in all of the forums of this organization. So I just wanted to highlight once again the great task of, or the great work of Ambassador Lucilena Baños at the head of this group and all of the states that have seconded her. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and I give the floor now to the Ambassador of Spain.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank the Mission of Mexico for having given impetus to the holding of this special session of the Permanent Council. I take this opportunity to salute or to the mandate carried out by Ambassador Baños at the head of the LGBTI core group and offer the any support that she might deem of interest from the Mission of Spain. Also, I'd like to congratulate the Chairman of the Permanent Council for the actual holding of this session to consider the topic of best practices for inclusion of LGBTI persons in the Americas. I'm also grateful to the panelists for their remarks, which have given us a better snapshot of the region in respect of the rights of LGBTI persons, LGBTI plus persons. I also note the importance of this session for giving voice to the reality of so many people who are living today, unfortunately, because of their sexual orientation and gender identity, who are experiencing situations of discrimination and even of being silenced. And therefore, I take the floor on behalf of Spain to note our highest commitment to the defense of the rights of LGBTI persons, both in Spain and internationally. And also we are committed to adopting the measures necessary to continue going forward in the inclusion and recognition of rights and freedoms, as well as eradicating hate speech, discrimination, and attacks and violence that today continue to impact LGBTI plus persons. Spain gives impetus to the agenda for inclusion, diversity, respect of equality in our borders and beyond. Indeed, Spain recognizes the rights of LGBTI plus persons internationally. And therefore, I'd like to draw attention to a project which the Spanish International Cooperation Agency is financing at the OAS, has been for some years, and which we feel a shared pride in this. And I'm referring to the program for strengthening access to civil registration institutions for good practices for incorporating self-identified gender identity in identity documents. And this is a program that's already been referred to in the course of the session. In this program of the Department of Effective Public Management, it's had a positive impact in the region on the lives of real persons and their families. And it brings about a process of transformation towards greater respect for diversity and for transsexual persons. I'd also like to highlight that from PUICA, the program for the universalization of civil identity in the Americas that I was referring to, through the Art Museum of the Americas, with the support of the LGBTI core group of the OAS during the mandate of the ambassador of Costa Rica, the Inter-American Commission and this observer mission of Spain that I represent launched a open call this year to trans, non-binary, and gender diverse artists of the Americas with the aim of organizing a thematic presentation at the museum for 2023. We hope that this call and the presentation of the works at the art museum would help give visibility to the reality of the artists in question. In particular, it would help strengthen the exercise of respecting economic, social, cultural, civil, and political rights of trans persons in the member states of the OAS. And to conclude, as you see, also at the OAS, Spain's commitment is tangible, and we intend to continue supporting the agenda of diversity, non-discrimination, inclusion, and respect. You know that Spain is a pioneer in legislative recognition of the rights and freedoms of LGBTI plus persons. Ever since, in 2005, our country became the third country in the world to legalize same-sex marriage at the same time as Canada, with full recognition of the families, including any children, and including adopted children. And then in 2009, for the law on sexual equality for transsexual persons. Also in the current legislature, several novel provisions are being brought about, having to do with discrimination and equal treatment in respect of trans persons, among others, and we'll be happy to make this available to the LGBTI core group as evidence of the kinds of advances that can help accompany the best practices being carried out of the region. And I bid farewell by referring to the appeal made in this permanent council as to the need to continue working as regards sexual diversity, gender diversity, and family diversity as one of the positive values of democratic societies. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador of Spain. And I give the floor to the Secretary General.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Desde 2016, el grupo LGBT.
Since the LGBTI core group has progressed in protecting and promoting the rights of the LGBTI collective by addressing the challenges of these people in the Americas. We thank the group under the coordination of Mexico for convening this special session on the best practices for the inclusion of LGBTI persons in the Americas. And we also thank the presenters and panelists for sharing their best practices and thoughts on this for including LGBTI persons in the Americas. Americas is one of the most advanced regions with respect to making progress in the rights of LGBTI persons. Most people have decriminalized consensual sex between adults, and compared with other regions, LGBTI persons are better protected against discrimination, violence, and other indicators. Despite this, in some countries, countries, because of beliefs or values, there are people that reject LGBTI persons. Exchange of practices to promote best practices for including these peoples is a way to fight discrimination, physical and psychological abuse, and also to fight against unequal access to health care and work. As the Secretary, Mary Carmen Plata, pointed out, we need to try to get to people's hearts, but the OAS can show that the acceptance and tolerance is important, and that people in vulnerable situations are successful. This has a positive impact on society. We all win. So it is important to have meetings like this one so that the OAS, with its convening power, can show that we are facing the challenges of LGBTI persons in the Americas and show the efforts of states to include them through the Department of Social Inclusion and also the Unit for Civil Society Relations. A series of activities for awareness raising have been organized to show best practices in inclusion. For example, the Round Table in 2019 for economic empowerment, tourism in the LGBTI persons, which was convened by the Department of Social Integration and Economic Development, and others by the IECHR. During the event, the panelists share their experience of innovative programs of tourism for LGBTI, which is a way to earn income and have social inclusion. More recently, in 2022, the LGBTI core group under the chairmanship of Costa Rica organized a webinar to explore the challenges of LGBTI persons in mobility in the Americas. We are happy about the dissemination of best practices to include LGBTI persons in the Americas. We have a long way to go, but we are starting to see changes with the influence of civil society, also within those that cooperate with the OAS. We have dialogues, we have processes, and we have the voice being heard of these peoples. The OAS has an obligation to its citizens to ensure that every person can live better. For too long, the LGBTI community was condemned to be silent and be invisible to our society. We hope that in the Americas, we continue to learn from each others and that we can become a region that is more inclusive and overcome the stigma of being the most unequal region in the world. We can do this if we include all cultures and everyone in our economy. Thank you.
Dear colleagues, it's 5 o'clock, and I don't know if we had this timing in our heads, but it comes to this. We have concluded consideration of the agenda for this meeting. Today's presentations, as well as the comments by delegations, will be reflected in the corresponding minutes of this special meeting. I thank you all for your participation, and the meeting is adjourned.